All right, thank you for joining tonight, everybody. First of all, my name's Casey, and I would like to welcome you all here tonight on behalf of the Glenelg Libraries. I'd also like to start by respectfully acknowledging the traditional lands and the waters that make up the Gunditjmara country that we are broadcasting from tonight. I acknowledge the elders past, present, and emerging, and through them all Aboriginal people. I'm very excited tonight to be chatting with the best-selling Australian author, Brooke McAlary, about her newest book, Care, The Radical Art of Taking Time. Author of international best-selling and one of my personal favourites, Slow, Brooke is passionate about slow living and is also has a podcast, the Slow Home Podcast, which I recommend you guys checking out. So 6 years ago, Brooke was completely overwhelmed. She had 2 young children, a husband that worked long hours, a business and a home filled to the brim with all of the trappings of a successful life, and a severe case of postnatal depression, which I'm sure some of us can relate to. And everything changed once she started to declutter her home, and now she and her husband are self-employed and enjoy life centred on the important things, which turn out not to be things at all. So welcome, Brooke. I'm so excited to have you.
Oh, Casey, thank you. Thank you for such a cool introduction too. I'm really stoked to be talking to you.
Yeah, same. In person or not, it's great to have you.
Soon, one day.
Very soon. So we're here to chat about your new book, which I enjoyed reading myself. Very excited to read that. So can you tell us about the book just in a couple of sentences?
Yeah, so that's tricky. A couple of sentences.
I know. Hard question first off.
Yeah, that's okay. We dig in. It's essentially a really deep dive into what care is, going beyond the stereotypical ideas of care and self-care, and looking at all the different ways that we can show up in our lives in acts of care. And it's arranged around like 9 core kind of ideas, core types of what I call small care. There, that was probably 2 sentences.
No, that's okay. That's great. So going off that, what's the difference between big care and self-care and small care?
Yeah, so as a bit of context, last year, like a lot of people, I think, I found myself completely cared out at about April, May of 2020. And I mean, looking back, there's no surprise that we felt like that and probably still feel like that in some instances, because we had the drought and then we had the bushfires and then we had the floods and then COVID hit and then 2020 took us all on that very wild ride, and 2021's, got on its heels. And I found myself as someone who I pride myself on, caring. I care about the world. I care about the people who live in the world. I care about my community and, the planet. And that's something that I've always identified myself as. And then one day I woke up and I couldn't care. Like, I felt numb and it was really scary. And that was when I started to think about, well, what does caring mean, And I realized that there's a spectrum of care, in that on one end you've got what I call big care, and that's, COVID, that's climate crisis, that's, social inequality and racial injustice, is like the big systemic collective global things that are really important, really big and really overwhelming if that's all we focus our time and energy on.
Definitely.
And then I thought, well, what if I dive into the other end of the spectrum and go into self-care? Will that help me to, regain some of my ability to feel and engage and, show up again in ways that I want to? And it did to a certain point, but I also then found on that end of the spectrum that self-care has it's kind of problematic in a lot of ways, in that the way it's marketed to us now means we need to spend money, and it helps if we're already well, and, particularly helpful if you're wealthy and, you've got access and time and energy. So I thought, are they the 2 types of care that we have access to? And I didn't want to believe that it was. So I looked at what remained in the middle of this spectrum. And that's where I landed on the idea of small care, which really are those small and often tiny acts of care that leave us feeling uplifted, connected, cared for in any number of ways. And they can be self-focused, but they can also be other-focused. And what's different, I think, about small care is that very rarely do those acts of care exist in a vacuum. Like everything, every kindness, every act of connection, every moment of noticing has ripples, and those ripples reach out into our, into our families, communities, workplaces. Yeah.
I liked that you touched on that commercialization about care, and the fact that, it's not all about paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to go to a retreat for a whole week, because that's just not accessible to people. And since COVID hit us, it's very rarely accessible to even go and get a facial or a massage. So I loved that you touched on just the little things that people can do for themselves, and there's no cost to a lot of it. Like you said, it's not things and belongings.
Exactly.
It's
And that was one of the threads that was really important to me to weave all the way through the book, was like, how can I break this idea of care down into ways that are accessible to the vast majority of us, regardless of our finances or our time or our physical abilities or capacity or, space and access to facilities, all that sort of stuff. It just, I think that came almost from a place of frustration that there's so many benefits to be experienced when we practice this idea of care. And so many of us were being left out of the conversation because of all of those, all of those qualifiers.
Yeah, I like that. So I know we're here to talk about care, but how does care relate to your previous book, Slow? I've read them both, and I know the answer to that, but I just, let's share.
I think in one way, it's a continuation of exploring time, and how we spend it, and why that is important. Like in Slow, I talked a lot about living life according to the things that are important to you. So firstly, figuring out what those things are. And as you said, they're very often not things at all, but people and, legacy and what we stand for. And Slow really looked at how to create that space and time to do that. And care is kind of a continuation of that, in that how do we then show up in our lives so that we're in, alignment with our values and our priorities. And we can do that through all those different kind of acts of care that I explore in the book. But I think the other thing that really I hadn't considered super closely until you mentioned it a second ago is that Slow obviously was about that idea that what is most important in life is not material. It's not the stuff we own. It's not the status symbols that we collect. It's about who we spend time with and how we spend that time. And care really is a digging deeper into that idea of, extracting ourselves from the capitalist side of
absolutely, yes,
care and these movements, and looking at it through the lens of humanity and, connection and, I guess, community in a very broad manner of speaking.
Yeah, and I think more than ever, people need community more than things. I think absolutely. If anything, COVID has taught us that community and connection is so important. It looks slightly different now, obviously, but all the things that we've gathered don't actually bring us joy.
That's it.
In a sense. Some things do, obviously, but, you know.
They don't keep the loneliness at bay either. We can have a house full of stuff and be perfectly comfortable, but I don't think there's stuff that you can buy that will lead you to that sense of belonging, that comes with community and, taking up space in the world and being seen to do that as well. There's something so powerful, and I think we all need it. And I'm a super introverted person, And COVID has been really interesting for me because it has highlighted that as much as I like my own company, I absolutely need to have that interaction with people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so too. So, what was it like riding through COVID and lockdown, and what did you find filled your cup while doing that? How did you balance that?
I don't know that I balanced it very well, to be perfectly honest. It was tough, you know, and I had so many conversations with fellow writers and creators throughout that time, and we all found it really, really difficult to focus, you know, and to dig into that creative space, just because there's so much information pouring into our heads daily that at some point during the day you max out on decision making and, you know, the amount of energy you can give things. And writing obviously takes a lot of both of those. So I stopped writing for a couple of months. And in the end, I think it was the best thing that I could have done. Because it gave me permission to just let this really weird time in the world be a really weird time in the world, and not try and carry on as though everything's fine and nothing's changed.
I think we tried to do that for a while, didn't we? Everyone just kind of went, "Oh, this will go away."
Yeah,
just
I was
pretend
in such
it's not happening.
denial.
Yeah.
You know, so I think that was really helpful, and that is, funnily enough, kind of what I reflected on when I was writing some of the later chapters in the book, like what happens when we give ourselves permission to not just push through. You know, and that's something I explore in the rest and the healing chapters.
I loved the rest.
Thank you.
I loved that chapter, and that resonated with me. Who sits for 15 minutes and does nothing? Like, that is so, it's strange and hard.
Yep.
Like I meditate myself personally and stuff like that, but to just actually be and sit with your own thoughts, it's quite daunting for a lot of people, I think. I think that chapter was really, those last two chapters, I read them twice.
That's really okay. That's cool.
I reread them. They were really cool because it's not something that people talk about. It's not something that society lets be okay.
Exactly. We don't have role models who acknowledge that we need to rest, and resting is not, it's not consuming. It's not like binging Netflix and listening to podcasts and reading. They're all fine and great. But it's also, rest is also not producing. As much as we like to think we're being kind of chill when we're pottering and, you know, doing little bits and pieces at a leisurely pace, that's not nothing. Nothing is the in-between, you know, where we just sit and we think our thoughts and that's it. Like, just be. There was I reference it in the book, actually. There was a study done a few years ago where a group of men and women were invited to sit in a room by themselves for 15 minutes. And they had no stimulus at all in that room. They just had to sit there and think their thoughts. And they had a choice. They could sit there for the 15 minutes and think their thoughts, or they could self-administer electric shocks.
Yes.
And 2/3 of the men self-administered electric shocks rather than sit there with their own thoughts. And it was about 1/4 of the women. So, you know, we're really uncomfortable with the idea of being alone with our thoughts.
Yeah, that's something I'm going to start adding to my life, I think. I'd really like to give it a go.
And just practice. You know, it's like a muscle. That's what I discovered, because I tried myself. I'm like, I'm just going to lay on my bed one day and not do anything for 15 minutes. And I could have sworn an hour had passed, and it was like 2 minutes, you know, not equipped necessarily. So you practice. And then I think once you know what it feels like to just sit in your thoughts and settle into that space in between, you can start, you know, going for aimless walks or sitting in the garden or, you know, throwing the ball to your dogs or whatever it might be, and still be in that space. But you need to practice. You need to build up the strength.
The muscle.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So a lot of people are at home, obviously, with their children and families. Is there anything, you know, how can we bring care or teach our children about care? I feel like, you know, there's so much tech and stuff at the moment, especially with homeschooling and stuff, and connecting with friends is always, obviously now, not in person, it's all online. So how do we teach them and bring that into their little lives?
Yeah, and I think it's hard to kind of start to strike that balance, but so important because, as you said, so much of their time is spent digitally, and it's by necessity, you know, and so we do it. But one of the things that I find probably the most powerful, and it takes such a short amount of time for kids to switch into this mode, is to go outside, you know, into any outdoor space that you have access to, whether that's a balcony, a front step, a backyard, a park, the footpath out the front of your apartment building, you know, and encourage them to just sit and pay attention to something tiny, whether it's an ant crawling along the ground or a bird's nest or, you know, seedlings starting to pop out of the dirt, digging in the dirt, finding worms, and do it with them and kind of find that sense of wonder in those tiny little details. And you'll find that your kids are much better at it than you are because they still have that ability, you know, that everything's a bit magic. So if you show up to do that with them, even if it's for 5 minutes a day, or if your kids get a brain break, do one of the brain breaks outside, you know, looking at something, anything, cloud watching, listening to the different bird songs. The thing that happens is it's kind of like a multi-pronged benefit to it because it gets everyone outdoors and into the, you know, into wild spaces. And the footpath out the front of your house is a wild space, you know, and as we start to sense the rhythms and the movement and the other beings and creatures and plants that live there, we begin to gradually see ourselves as part of that kind of space. And I think that allows us to, you know, feel a sense of stewardship and belonging to our own little corner of the world. But it also invites awe into our days, and awe is super powerful as an emotion, as an experience. And the benefits of awe are basically a laundry list of all the things that we need more of in life at the moment. Like people who experience awe, kids and adults alike, are happier. You know, they have higher happiness hormone levels. Yep. So as a result, they're less stressed. They are more patient. I know I need that when my kids are with homeschooling. They're more generous. They're more likely to feel cooperative and collaborative. And the thing I think that most adults' eyes light up at when I talk about is that people who experience awe frequently feel like they have more time, even though we've got the same amount that we had before. And I think that that is quite literally a list of things that we all need at the moment. So yeah, with your kids,
kind of strips it back and simplifies it, which again, that's that passion for slow living. It's going back to that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I love
slow it down.
I love like looking at the tiniest of mundane details and finding something joyful or delightful or unexpected there.
Yeah. So reconnecting with nature is one of the key ideas in care and a personal favourite of mine. I really enjoyed that as well. How did you become to realise that you were disconnected from nature, and why was it so important to tap back into the natural world and becoming a part of nature, because we are a part of the natural world?
I think that shift in perspective is so important, which is why I always encourage people to get outside as much as possible. But for me, I grew up as a really outdoorsy kid, and I think I thought that I automatically became an outdoorsy adult. And it wasn't really until I was older, I was married, I had kids, that I realized like I hardly ever went outside except to hang the clothes on the line or maybe walk the kids around the block in the stroller. And it's strange that that's how I ended up, because I had a stack of veggie gardening books on my bedside table for years, and I read them cover to cover, like back to front, inside out. All the details about crop rotation and the importance of composting and, you know, getting heirloom seeds and all that kind of stuff. I knew it all. But I didn't have a veggie garden. Instead, I got addicted to a digital farming game. You know, I think that was a very clear sign from my inner gardener that I needed to get outside into nature. But it took me a little while. Like, I wasted many hours of my life, like, planting pretend crops of apples and soybeans and stuff.
Not being able to eat them.
Exactly. And like, I would rotate the crops in this game. It didn't matter. It didn't do anything. It was an absurd thing to have done. But when I finally figured out that actually probably what I really need is to get outside, I was then overwhelmed by the process. Like, how do you go from screen addict to organic vegetable gardener? And going back to what you said, I decided to adopt that idea of going really small and really slow with the changes, and instead just spent 1 minute a day walking through my garden after I'd hung the clothes out and looking at the flowers that were blooming, or the bees, or, you know, what the ants were doing with their nests, or whatever. It didn't matter, whatever was happening seasonally. And I started to gain a sense of understanding of the seasons, of the movements of you know, the other things that lived in the same area that I did. And from there, it just started to really grow, and I started bushwalking, and, you know, my kids got to the age where they could come with me, and it just became this sort of expanding relationship. And within a couple of years, I realized that usually the answer to whatever question that I have or whatever issue I'm struggling with can, if not be found, can certainly be shaken loose when I'm outside. Yeah. So yeah, it's just, to me, if I'm feeling cranky, if I'm restless, if I'm feeling unwell, obviously not if you're feeling unwell in the ways that we're worried about at the moment, but like, I'm not telling you to go outside if you're feeling well. But generally speaking, the answer can be found in time outdoors. You know, I go for a bushwalk, and within 5 minutes, it doesn't matter how bad a mood I was in to start with, within 5 minutes, I am grinning like, you know, the Cheshire cat, because tree medicine and the sounds and the smells and the light and the feel all just connects me to something much, much, much bigger than myself. And as a result, I think you gain perspective and your problems become right-sized rather than oversized.
I agree. And the tree medicine, I didn't know that. We spend lots of time outside and we do lots of bushwalking as well. So it was nice to know that the feel good was actually a feel good. Like, it is actual medicine.
It is actual medicine. It's phenomenal.
Magical, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the reason that I included so many of those facts and, you know, so much research in the book, was because often we know that things are good for us, but if we don't know why, I think we kind of tend to underestimate their power. So I could say, yeah, I know I feel better if I go for a bushwalk. But if I can say to myself, no, but you'll be breathing in tree chemicals like phytoncide, and your immune system will function more effectively for 6 weeks afterwards. Or, you know, if you go for a barefoot bushwalk, you will change like the way that your feet move, and the ligaments and bones in your feet will move. Like, to know that kind of stuff, I think, is really, it's good for the skeptics in us as well.
Yeah, I agree. So what makes you think that kindness, and particularly self-kindness, is the key to unlocking one of humanity's superpowers?
Good question.
I was excited to ask.
Yeah. Okay, so I had a really interesting relationship with the idea of kindness, in that I've always thought that it was important and powerful in like a nice way. But I didn't necessarily know that, you know, we often, and this is me probably from 3 or 4 years ago talking, we talk about if we're faced with hatred or, you know, anger or rage or, you know, those sorts of really scary negative emotions from other people, we face it with kindness. And I got it. Like, I thought that was a nice idea, but I didn't see how it could match, you know, rage and kindness. How do they match each other? Is that a fair fight? So I always brought my kids up to be kind, and I always tried to walk through my day kindly, but I didn't necessarily think it was a world-changing idea until COVID, actually. And it offered this incredible counterpoint to so much of the aggression and the greed that we saw, particularly in the early days, you know, people fighting over bags of rice and flour and that kind of stuff. And it was just fear. People were just afraid. But almost as soon as those stories started dominating news headlines, there was this whole other movement of, you know, good news and kindness and random acts of kindness. And I felt like they created this incredibly beautiful bond between strangers. So, you know, I started reading about kindness, and I was sort of beginning to write the book at this point, started reading about kindness and discovered that it is so incredibly powerful as an act that we can offer to other people. But the reason that so many of us don't is because we don't necessarily have a lot of space for kindness for ourselves. And that, I think, ended up being why I had such resistance to the idea of kindness. Because in order to offer it freely into the world, I needed to offer it to myself. And that is not something that I was ever good at. And it's not really something that we're encouraged to do or sort of shown
It's
how.
really a society thing, isn't it? Like lots of, you know, if you're super kind to yourself, you're almost looked at as selfish in
Exactly.
some senses. Yeah.
So I think, you know, I took it two ways. Initially, the reason I wanted to practice this idea of self-kindness was because I was desperate to raise kids who liked themselves. You know, and if we were able to raise children who like themselves most days, the world will be very different by the time they're adults, because so much of what we're sold, going back to stuff and, you know, so much of what we're sold is marketed towards our pain points. And those pain points are things that we've been taught are like wrong about us. We're broken. We're not good enough. We're not, you know, whatever enough. So if I was able to raise kids who were a lot more resilient against that kind of messaging, imagine, like, can you imagine how different their lives would be? And hopefully as a result, you know, their friends' lives and their schoolmates and all that kind of stuff.
Their communities, yeah.
Exactly. So, and if you're able to kind of see that through a 10,000-foot view, you can really see how teaching people to like themselves or to be kind to themselves can be a genuinely world-changing idea, because all of a sudden those pain points aren't so painful anymore because we like ourselves.
And then we don't give in to all of those, you know, buy this and you'll be happy, or spend money on this and you'll be happy. And
because they're basically just telling us that there's something wrong with us, you know, that we're broken. So ultimately that was where I realized that I had to do that work for myself and on myself before I was able to gift it to other people. And it's hard, like it's really tough. It's not something that I think we're particularly well equipped to do. But even just turning up the volume a little bit on that voice that says, that was great, well done. Or, you know, yeah, you got out of bed today and you didn't want to, or, you know, whatever.
Giving yourself that compliment that you give other people.
Exactly. Yeah. And learning how to, you know, deal with the awkwardness and the guilt factor of spending a bit of time being kind to yourself. It repeats itself. We just need to allow ourselves to do it and to learn to be comfortable with it, and to encourage it in other people too.
Yeah, definitely. So the chapter on play, I found that really interesting, and especially because I have two younger children at the moment. And you seemed nervous writing it.
Yeah.
You said you were nervous a bit, you know. Why is that? And within writing it, did you find anything that helped shift that nervousness? Or, you know, do you find now that, I don't know, play doesn't always come naturally to adults, but do you find that there was a shift after that?
I do actually, which is wonderful, because I had a very complex relationship with the idea of play. I had just convinced myself from when my kids were really little that I wasn't playful. I wasn't the fun parent. My husband's the fun parent. You know, he's the jump on trampoline parent. He's the wrestle in bed parent. He's the parent who will make a joke when I would probably get cranky. You know, he's just got that I don't have. And I do think that probably broadly speaking, it's women who struggle with this, this kind of...
We have a certain role to uphold, I feel.
Exactly, yeah. And play is not something that is put up as a priority. And And that's what I found. I think this is why I was so nervous to write it, because I didn't find playing with my kids playful. I did. I was happy to do it because I knew that it was benefiting them. It was benefiting our relationship. It was important. So I did it most of the time. Not always. But I started to research what play actually is. And the people who study play, incredibly intelligent people, lots of them, they can't actually agree on what play is because it looks different to everybody, other than play is needless. And this was the really big realization for me when I wrote this chapter, was that when I was playing with my kids and finding it kind of like a chore, sorry.
Yeah.
That's because it wasn't play. It wasn't needless. I was doing it for a reason. And that really switched something in me. So, then the question became, well, what does play look like for me? And I had this conversation with my brother-in-law one Sunday morning. We'd gone to a water park with our kids. And he and I were talking about how unplayful we both were, and, how that kind of weighed heavily on us. And we felt guilty about it. And I didn't realize until later that we had this conversation while we were lining up to go on a water slide. And we were lining up to go on a water slide without our kids. Like, our kids weren't with us. We were just doing it for fun. Even that was important to go, well, this is play. Anything that gets me out of the effects of gravity, that's play. And that's why I love roller coasters and, riding a mountain bike and skiing and that kind of stuff. So really broadening the picture, broadening the definition of play has been so helpful to me in accessing that lighter side. And I have found that unexpectedly, I'm more likely to laugh now and make a joke rather than get cranky. And that's probably partly because my kids are a bit older and I feel like I've got a bit more capacity in that sense. But it's been kind of liberating to realize that when I want to dance in the kitchen when I'm cooking breakfast, that's because I'm trying to be playful. When I want to dig in the veggie garden and like squeeze the mud through my fingers, like that's play. And it's incredibly joyful.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is. All right. So lastly, what is one of the go-to acts of small care that you personally enjoy and practice?
I think practicing doing nothing is actually one of the ones that is super important. Tough to, as we've already discussed, but learning to just be. And even that doesn't need to be 15 minutes is brilliant. And if you want to set a timer and put yourself away somewhere quiet for 15 minutes, then go for it. But even 30 seconds, of staring out the window in between writing emails, or scheduling 5 minutes at the back of every Zoom call that you do for work, and giving yourself that time to stare out the window or to doodle in the corner of your notepad, to daydream, to, kind of dig back into a memory. It doesn't matter what you do with it, but really scheduling that time and creating a buffer that allows you to simply be and really learn to resist the temptation of picking up your phone or checking the news headlines or, scrolling through Facebook or whatever it might be, because that tech particularly will steal every single free moment of your day if you let it. Even if we tell ourselves it'll only be for a minute, it's usually for longer than a minute.
It's never a minute.
Never
a minute.
I get on my phone to check my bank balance, and then suddenly I'm on Instagram and I've checked all 3 news websites and my emails and.
Yes.
So I think that learning how to create boundaries around our tech use is probably one of the more boring acts of care that we could all benefit from.
Yeah.
One of the ones that I think is just a delight is to find a sit spot, in your yard or in your house somewhere that has a view of something green, whether it's a pot plant or, next door neighbour's yard or your own backyard, and just sit for a few minutes a day, maybe while you're drinking a cup of tea or coffee. Maybe if you journal, you write a 1-line journal a day or something, but just develop that sense of settling into a physical place and observing the way it changes over the days and weeks and months. And, I love, I get a genuine thrill when I hear the black cockatoos now that fly over my house some months of the year, because it feels like, you can see the shifting seasons, and that feels like a sense of, belonging.
Yeah, and you can kind of own that spot.
Exactly.
And, your body will just start to recognize that spot and relax as soon as you find that spot.
Yeah.
It becomes kind of part of your ritual or your routine.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of the idea of ritualizing like normal things, because that elevates them into something a little bit special without you don't have to go and do anything extravagant. You can just go and grab your cup of tea and sit on the back step. That's a ritual, and it's like a settling into a moment. The other thing that I view as a ritual every day, and it's such a strange little thing, is opening the curtains in our living room and like greeting the day, regardless of the weather. There's just something really grounding in doing that. Yeah.
I like that. Now, are you happy to answer any questions? If anyone's got any questions, they can pop them into the chat. So Maya is wondering, so she would love to hear how you got your book contract.
Okay, good question. So this is my third book, and I wrote a book called Destination Simple in 2015, and I self-published it on Amazon. And it did.
Done.
Thank you. It did fine, and it was like, it's a nice book, and it's a lovely book that kind of really, like I was talking about, digs into the idea of ritual and rhythms. And then I started my podcast at about the same time. And I think, to be perfectly honest, it was the podcast that really got the attention of who became my publisher, a woman named Alan and Unwin. She got in touch with me, asked if I'd ever considered writing a book. And this is sort of 3 years into our podcast. So asked if I'd ever considered writing a book about slow living. And I'd written a proposal based on a template I found online at some point about 6 months previous. And I sent that to her, and looking back, it was very overblown and would be about, 200,000 words long. But I sent that off to her, and I didn't hear anything for months, probably 3 months, maybe longer. And I had written it off as something that wasn't going to happen. And then I got an email from her asking if they could, if I would be interested in writing the book that I had pitched. But then they also asked if they could buy the rights of my ebook and publish that as a print book. So it was kind of a bit of a convoluted process. But if I was to give like a headline, it would be that I had been writing online as a blogger and podcasting about this topic for many years. And I guess I had a body of work that I could show, that showed that I understood the topic and had a point of view on it too, which I think mattered, rather than just kind of following the trends of slow living.
Yeah, great. Fabulous. Thanks, Maya said. Does anyone else have any questions? Tracy, so is Care available in an audio format? I know Tracy has listened to Slow twice on audio. She has. So she's,
keenly waiting for the audiobook.
She's keenly waiting for Care.
The short answer is yes, it will be, and it should have already been out, except that life had other plans. So I had recorded the first day of the audiobook back in April, first day of 5, and then my dad got really sick and ended up in oh, thank you. He thankfully has recovered, but he spent 14 weeks in the ICU. So wow. It was pretty intense, and I ended up living most of the time with my mum, supporting her. So it got put on the back burner, understandably. And I have just started this week recording the audiobook in my wardrobe. So the studio is closed.
That's great.
Hopefully before the end of the year. And if you hear roosters and cockatoos and things in the background, that's because it's just country living for you. So yes.
Oh, that's great. I think the roosters and the cockatoos might add to it.
I think so. I mean, I don't think they'll do anything bad to the recording.
No. Does anyone else have any questions? Let me just have a little look. No one else is writing.
It's always that moment, like at a live event, where you
Like,
just, yeah, exactly.
just wait a minute.
Whatever you want to say.
We've got someone, Caroline is just writing, so we'll just wait a sec. So Caroline's wondering, what do you like to read?
Good question. I read a huge amount of fiction, and up until last year, the beginning of last year, I read a lot of dystopian fiction, which I can't do at the moment, and haven't been able to for the last 18 months or so. So as a result, I read a lot of middle grade fiction and young adult fiction, and I just find it a delight. So
yeah,
I mean, The Hunger Games is like my go-to read because I just think the world building in it is phenomenal. But I think I've shifted a lot to fantasy and magical realism and that kind of book. A, because my daughter likes reading that sort of genre, and I like reading what she reads. But B, because I think there's just so many well-written kids and young adult books now that have a sense of lightness that, you know, equivalent adult books don't always have. So yeah, I read a lot of young adult and middle grade fiction. What else have I read recently though that I've really enjoyed? I'm a big Stephen King fan, which I have not really read any of his books in the last year and a half. I'm just trying to protect my heart a little bit. Yeah. But actually, this is the most recent nonfiction book that I read, Future Steading by Jade Miles. It's wonderful. It's so brilliant. It's such a practical book about the byline is living like tomorrow matters, but it's so beautiful and so practical. And she breaks down life on life for anyone, regardless of where you live, whatever your location in the country is. She breaks things down into like a seasonal approach, but much more, much more ritualistic seasons rather than autumn, winter, spring, summer, like the awakening and then high heat. And it's brilliant. I really highly recommend it for anyone who's interested in slow living, who's interested in growing food, who's interested in strengthening community through through a multitude of different ways, but obviously centered around food. Yeah, it's awesome.
Interesting. Caroline said thank you. Sienne's just said, you've planted the seed. We'll just have to slow down now and read your book now. So that's great. That's really awesome. We've got no more questions coming through, I don't think. So you can purchase Care online from any good bookstore, or locally here in Portland, our newsagents has both Care and Slow available. They got that in, so you can drop in and see them or give them a ring to pick it up and purchase it. And of course, we have both copies of Brooke's books in the library, which you can borrow for free. And if they are out, which they are because they're popular, you can pop a hold on them as well. So thank you so much, Brooke. It was really lovely to speak to you.
Tracy, thank you.
Yeah, we loved having you. So take care, and thank you everyone for joining us. Margaret's at the Portland News Agency. We've got great job. Thank you, ladies. Thank you. Can you see the comments, Brooke?
Yeah, it's really lovely.
Yeah, lovely.
Well, thank you all very much for coming out. This is my final book tour event, virtual book tour event. So it's such a nice way to fit in.
Lovely. Yeah, it's been great.